Let's see why we need a new pedagogy. These are some of the reality we live every day in. No comment needed. Education is very important, mainly, in my opinion, because it's a part of the social construction of reality. And nowadays, in the so-called Anthropocene era, we need to face, badly need, all the havoc, all the problem, mostly man-made. And why? Well, in my opinion, greed, of course, is an explanation, but also ignorance, alienation, feeling not part of my community, of my environment, and also, in my opinion, some of the fault lie with traditional education that has been actually sometimes not helping. So, a relevant question, in my opinion, is how our personal and social selves, identity, are socially structured, are socially construed. I think also another important question is how we structure reality is giving us tools to deal with the emergency we have to face. Just this. The World Health Organization calculated that in 12, so now it's worse, about 12.6 million deaths were, occurring somehow connected with problem of the environment that we pollute. 22% of the burden of disease is due to environmental attack to health and well-being. And for kids under 5 years old, 26%, more than a quarter, is due to bad influence, bad impact of environmental risk. So, as I said, education is a very important aspect of the social construction of reality, and is at the same time a process, getting education, like it's a process in the family, of course, that starts first, but also is a product. And this could be good news or very bad news. Why? Because dysfunctional education, an education that doesn't give you the tools to see and to act, is dysfunctional and give us, as a result, real damages. So, since education, science are the narrative to prepare new citizenship, a new generation, they are really empowering tools. But if the tools are not effective, actually they are disempowering. It's like nowadays we know how much damage disseminate fake news is. Disseminate false science, superstition science, thinking that the environment is just for our use, it's a commodity. It's like going to the supermarket, chopping down wood because we need wood. So we need to have a sustainable education based on reality, that is based on people needs, that is a people-centered education, and is scientifically grounded of our current knowledge with how people learn and develop their potentials. And going quickly, student-centered education, we have a lot of research. For example, if you're interested, you'll see some biblio opportunity. 47 million students we have researched in the past years all over the world. And we know that student-centered education pedagogy is congruent with the present scientific knowledge derived from the world of psychology, sociology, anthropology, neuroscience, and so forth. Also, research shows that it's more effective than traditional top-down professor teaching student instead of the professor, the teaching, being a promoter of learning. And is more effective than a traditional education, even if the subject is about the hard sciences, mathematics, biology, computer technology, e-learning. The better outcome are showing that they work no matter of the student population, of the country, of the gender, and the culture. Among the many positive results, better achievement of educational goal, better attendance, more satisfaction, better morale, better self-image, more critical thinking, better problem solving, better relationship between students in and outside the classroom, is socializing, and less destructive behavior or dropping out of school. Person-centered, student-centered, people-centered education also is an effective form of peace education because they learn how to listen, to work together, to be empathic and understand each other, to develop intimacy and trust, to basically develop their individual social health, and to develop not only their potentiality, but as well facilitate the development climate developing in the classroom, but also in the community. In other words, they learn how to learn. That, in my opinion, is more important than just learning the single subject. Of course, they have to know the single subject. We're not excluding that at all. But they have to learn self-respect, respect for others, but it's not enough. Because depending on what kind of pedagogy that we have, always at the bottom of the pedagogy, the vision of our human nature. If we have a vision that human nature has at disposal all the resources of the planet, we're really doing damage. We have to foster awareness and capacity to effectively relate, not only to people, not only to different genders, not only to different sexual orientation, not only different melanin contact of the skin. We have to relate to life and not to see a tree that is going to be a lot of toothpicks, not to see animals just how we can cook them. We have to see that we are part of life. So, since the time is rushing, but not yet the 2 minutes signal, so I'm going to give a good example. I think we dramatically need, before it's too late, to effectively protect and promote human and environment capital. We need to think globally, but every day act locally. And I mean, I need to say these nice words, but I have to go home and relate this way to my wife, relate this way to my colleagues, relate this way to my neighbor, even those I don't like that much. Otherwise, these are just words, and these are, again, one of the many things that are part of the problem, not of the solution. Thank you. And now, next, let me put the glasses on. We have Anne Snick of the System Approach of Public Innovation and Responsible Research in Brussels, which is Belgium, and is also on the board of the European chapter of the Club of Rome. Please, Anne, as you know, 12 minutes.
Thank you. I was triggered by the invitation to this conference. There is this gap between education and the current societal reality. It's still not quite clear to me whether the biggest gap is between education and the fourth industrial revolution or education and the sixth extinction. Which one is more urgent? But anyway, this gap between how we thought about what were we thinking about education and what kind of thinking do we need today is what triggered me, as I'm a philosopher of education. So the question is, what were we thinking? And then, secondly, can we trust our own thinking to detect the errors in our own thinking? Or is that like the Baron of Munchausen pulling himself by his hair out of the morass? So maybe instead of thinking, we should think about or explore other ways of learning. So usually when I talk to learners, and they can be students or they can be higher education teachers, I start with a story that I learned from Jared Diamond about the Vikings that colonized about 1,000 years ago. They colonized Greenland. There was like a temporary mild climate, and there was some green valleys. And there was a community of Inuit living there. They were hunter-gatherers, and they had ice houses, and they had, warmed their houses and had light from the oil from the whales that they caught. So their technology and their economy was totally in line with the way they saw their own culture, and they lived there, and they were very happy. And then the Vikings arrived, and they started agriculture, not just hunter-gatherer, but agriculture. They built wooden houses. They even built churches and a very beautiful cathedral. They had ships that they could do international trade with to import glass. So then I usually ask the learners, who do you think has the most advanced system, the most advanced socioeconomic system? Is it the Inuit or is it the Viking? And that helps them to reflect on, if they say the Viking, why do you say that? What is your implicit idea about advancement, human advancement, education, emancipation? And so usually very interesting answers come up. I give them the time to reflect, and all the answers are welcome. There's not a right and a wrong answer, because it's a complex story, of course. And then I finish with, how does a story end? I show them that the Inuit, who were like totally within living within the boundaries of that, like what you see here, the biophysical processes at that part of the planet. So the Inuit were totally in harmony with that, both in their idea of what a good life is and in their economics and technology. Whereas the Viking considered themselves superior, more advanced, superior identity, but after 450 years, they starved to death. And the very interesting thing is that they preferred to starve to death rather than give up their cultural identity and learn from the Inuit the more appropriate economic and technological means to survive in that region. So then the question, of course, I ask the learners, like, why do I tell you this story? And they also come up with very interesting answers. The question is, of course, are we any wiser than the Vikings? That is the big question. And then I show them this slide. That was also shown by Carlos Alvarez Pereira. We are, the bottom line is the Human Development Index. It's combining education, life expectancy, and income per capita. It's a combined metric. And you can see that this is how we have defined and organized human development. We have defined it in a way that does not take into account the reality of the planet, because on the left, the vertical axis, you see the number of planets we need to realize that kind of development. So we are totally in overshoot. And a part of that, of course, is that we organize health and education by taxing the economic growth, the percentage of that goes to education, so we always will deplete, we have an extractive economic system, and part of it is redistributed for education and health. And what I learned yesterday is that health now today is more and more pressured also to contribute to the growth, to be commercial, etc. So here we have a perfect vicious circle. And then you can show that how that works. Are we any wiser than the Vikings? We are definitely also locked into this mental state that does not allow us to react to the sixth extinction and the climate change that is coming. We have defined economy in such a way, or organized economy in such a way, that the growth of the economy as a subsystem has become the goal. Prosperity is a goal in itself, and people and planet, are resources, human resource or human capital and planetary resources. So because this growth model is incompatible with the real growth of the biophysical processes, the speed at which the solar energy and the materials can replenish what we call the resources, the biophysical processes, they get scarce, especially because we also use non-renewables a lot. So they get scarce, so there's a huge competition for these scarce materials. So people are getting more and more pushed to become competitive. Education has to make our children competitive. And it's a vicious circle. So it's really a race to the bottom, and we don't know if we're going to get out of that in time. And in the background of that, Indo-European cultures, very, very old, we're talking centuries back, have this deep-rooted idea that man was created in the image of God as the culmination of creation. We are above nature. We are not part of nature. We are above nature. And God has given nature to us as a resource to use for our whims. And scientists have kicked God out, but they hold on to this image that they can now rewrite the book of life. They're playing Homo Deus right now, and nature is still the resource for us to use. That is the deep, the Viking consideration that we have. And the result is that we're like running an old car in a closed garage because the CO2 in our planet is going nowhere. So if we stop the engine, we stop the car, like our current economic system will suffer, collapse, whatever, no jobs. If we don't stop this engine, we will also suffer and maybe, go extinct. So with that, we go back to what I call, this is like it's a very complex and nonlinear system. Like you saw the line of the Viking, it went up, they were very successful, and then all of a sudden it collapses. So this is like a tool that helps the learners to make sense of that, to map the complexity of our current society. You see autocatalysis or autopoiesis in the top. You know Prigozhin, I hope. We are now evolving to the next level of complexity. We also have entropy. I'm not going into details there. We have the sun and the moon together with the minerals, etc., that together create an isolated system. There's, first law of thermodynamics. Nothing is coming in. We have our patterns of making sense of life and death. How do we define a quality life, the good life? How do we define that? And then what means have we created to access the biophysical resources, basis to fulfill that, what we have defined as our dream, as our vision of culture. And I call that ET because it's, it's economic and technology. It's like the double helix, they sort of like make this growth keep going. And I think that the very important ones and the ones that are often overlooked is the importance of the money system in here, and of course the population size. Those are very often omitted from the systemic maps that we use. And and of course then the human brain, the patterning instincts. How are we wired, so that all this goes together. And all the arrows show that these things interact with each other in nonlinear ways, in complex ways, etc. So this tool helps young people to say, if we say now, for example, we're going to change from non-renewable fossil fuel energy to, keep that intact, not change this, and not change the model of growth. We're just going to change the technology from non-renewable to renewable. Is that compatible with the map? And then they can say no, because you're using scarce minerals. you're still in, you're replacing one problem, the CO2, with another problem. The entropy, the dissipation of the rare minerals that we need, for the capture and the storage of the energy. So that helps them to detect what are real solutions. And I give them exercises, for example, explain how antibiotics, that was a fantastic innovation. So we thought, oh, I have an illness, I take a pill, I get healthy. So the more pills, the more health. And all of a sudden, nonlinearity, antibiotics are the biggest problem ever. So they learn to work with this. And then, of course, after all this bad news, I come up with the good news, and I say that we have now the agenda to go back into that, that bottom square is the SDGs. We're going to create human well-being within planetary boundaries. To do that, we're going to have to reinvent the ET from extraterrestrial economic and technology to technology and economics that are responsible and resilient in the Anthropocene. Terra means. And by peaceful cooperation and not economic warfare. So, this is the same, the goals on the Anthropocene map. And then I also show them, very important, that we have now different lines. We still have the extractive growth line, which is like the Viking line that is collapsing. I mean, we don't know exactly what will collapse. But I also show them that since 1972, the first report of the Club of Rome, I'm a little bit biased, but okay, it's a beautiful symbolic date. There is the light blue line is evolving. I've taken the turquoise, as a second tire color. That is, committed to bringing us back under the ceiling of the biophysical processes, and this is the SDGs, is the economic growth model. That is in SDG 8. We will have new economic technologies and economic models that help us to go back into the, create human progress within planetary boundaries. And then I show them a lot of examples where that already happens. It's not the smart house, because that is not future-proof if you look at the Anthropocene map, but going back to biomimicry, like what Carlos also said, we can learn a lot from Africa, and this is happening. We have community land trust instead of, speculation on ground. We have different building techniques with local materials and local communities doing the work, community-supported agriculture, tool libraries, etc. And then, of course, we need the institutions to upscale that. Like the European Commons Assembly is the legal part. We have networks, we have education, training here. We have community currencies here. All this, and this creates a virtuous circle for regenerative culture, for achieving all these, these central goals for well-being, etc. And so the four, I hope I don't offend anybody with my terminology. I did not want to talk about the 4 pillars of education, because a pillar is dead and static and linear. I took placentas, I couldn't come up with anything better.
Please conclude
quickly. So I think you have to give young people hope by showing this, showing this light blue line. Hope is very important. And then, sorry.
Can you please bring back the placentas? We all want to do that.
Yeah, sorry, I have to. I don't know what's happening. Oh, okay, I got it, okay. So I will not use the pointer. So this is, give them hope, say this is happening, it's already happening. It's full of alternatives that do what Eric was saying this morning, this more functional economy. It's happening, it's out there, it's just under the radar of politics, economics, academia, press. We don't talk about it, but it's there, its emergence is there. And then we also have to give them, the core values and stories about how important they are for our survival. Think of the Inuit. They had their cultural identity, and they were not unhappy. They were not feeling that they were not making any progress. They were happy, values. Then we also have embrace complexity, learn that just this complexity is very creative. It's going to help us to move forward as long as, we embrace complexity and nonlinearity and do not expect to control where we're going to go, but like Donella Meadows said, swing the system. Learn to be adaptive and iterative research, etc. And of course, co-responsible learning. Nobody, not our generation can teach the young people how to do it, but they have to be given the responsibility and, the space where they can take the responsibility for their own future and co-create within the framework that we offer them. We're not saying, hey, we did it wrong, go and find something better. We are offering them frameworks like the SDGs and the Anthropocene map and the timelines. And that usually inspires them greatly. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anne. And you answer your question probably, can we trust our thinking? Well, if we are aware that putting ourselves above nature can just make us go in the deep bottom, then it's clear. The time is very short, so I will ask also the next speaker, Ananta Dojapa, that is the president of the director of Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development in New Delhi, India, and is also a fellow of our academy. So please, 12 minutes, 10 minutes, I would let you know by sound.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alberto. He's a pretty tough taskmaster, so I'm going to straight get into the presentation. I think many of the problems have already been identified. In fact, as both the speakers were going on, I was saying there's not much left for me to say, but I'll still take my 12 minutes. This key message finding came out from the recent IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Science on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, similar to the IPCC, but focusing on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And here you got 1 million of Earth's. These are kind of pretty problematic findings that we are finding here. We are as supporting what Susan has already talked about, as Alberto, that we are on a downward spiral here. And it's a vicious downward spiral, and in many cases, kind of driven by our own, what I would sort of say, predatorial instincts, which has, from evolutionary to survival mode, and we are still in a survival mode. And I'm wondering whether we have actually reached a point where it's a tipping point where we don't need to be in a survival mode. I wanted to throw in the third one, which is not part of the IPBES, which kind of shocked me a little bit because as somebody who's new to India, when I took up this position, and this was a WHO report in 2015, it was saying 25% of children between the ages of 13 and 15. For me, kids of 13 and 15 should be having fun, should be playing around, not thinking about problems, maybe not of the world, but at least their own particular problems, but have some form of mental illness. And these are only reported numbers. So the numbers must be much, much more staggering. And a lot of that is driven by the education system. It is driven by the education system for one reason. Like recently, they had a release of their so-called, the famous results of, I think it's at grade 8 or 10. And on that particular day itself, 12 kids committed suicide because of the results that they received were not as high to the expectations. And many times, it's the parents who are primarily the main driver of this. That was not supposed to be blank, but okay. So these are some of the things that we kind of seeing. You have heard about global wicked problems, anxiety, depression. WHO says this is one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face in the 21st century. Intolerance of violent extremism growing. That's you read it in the papers on a daily basis. And the last one is the cost of education. Education now has become a really good, lucrative business rather than being a social good in what its true nature it should be. So if we know what's wrong, why do we still do it? Is it just a human characteristic? I look at where I am right now. I live in Delhi. And many of you must have heard of Delhi, especially it's become quite famous recently. We are the most polluted city in the world. When I talk about really pollution, you live it. I took up this position when I was about 55, 56 years old, never had bronchial asthma. In the first winter that I was there, I had bronchial asthma attacks. It's frightening. You have oxygen cut to your brains, you have seize out, you've collapsed. And I've never had this in my life. And this is a perfect daily thing that we face on a day-to-day basis, and yet we don't do anything. Why? I don't have any answers. So I think the thing is we are confronted with competing choices. So in a sense, what I'm kind of alluding to is this cognitive dissonance that goes on in our brains on our daily life. You have to balance different things. And so I look at that as a collective problem. I look at some of the more individual-based problems that we face on a day-to-day basis. Your conditions of stress, you're looking at job security, you want to maintain your same lifestyles, or as we have come to worship, material wealth. I don't know how many of you are on Facebook. I'm thinking of actually getting out of Facebook because all I see is they always say, who's the richest person in the world? It's like, who cares? But this is what it seems to be making news, rather than saying, who's the kindest person in the world? How many of you have heard of Matthew Ricard? Apparently he's supposed to be the kindest person in the world. He's been, right, today, fantastic person, but we never hear of him. Instead of that, we hear Jeff Bezos and, did I say Bozo or Bezos? I hope I got his name properly pronounced. And the others. And it's like, we got our metrics of success. Something is wrong with what we are doing. And I think many of the earlier presentations have already alluded to this particular point. So how do we break it? Right? Is education the solution? I don't think so. The way that we have right now, I don't think this is the solution. I live it. I had, my 7-year-old son was diagnosed as silly, dumb, a failure. This was at 7 years old. It came from an education system, which is not, we were in the Netherlands at that time, they just couldn't. But we diagnosed him as acute dyslexic. And he had a visual capacity at the 99%. He could do jigsaw puzzles backwards. He doesn't need to see them. So he's got different strengths. But the education system kind of already has stamped him as that. So we need a different system that looks at kids as each individual kid, who has their strengths and their weaknesses, and how do we address those. And it's competitive. When I was in school, when I come back, I still remember this very vividly. My mom keeps telling me not to say this anymore in public lectures, but it's such a great story. That when I came back with I had hit an 85%. And I was so excited. I was like, 85% because I had hit 60% before. And the first thing she says is, so what was the highest, who scored the highest? So I said, 99%. Well, hey, not good enough. So the pressure is there. Rather than sort of saying, hey, I've improved, since that I'm learning, that was not. So, and it's inbuilt. And I have to watch myself when I do it with my kids. So it's an automatic response, which goes in my brains. And immediately what I have to think, that's my system 1 thinking kicking in very quickly. And I have to really now have trained myself based on my own experience. My system 2 tries to not let the system 1 hijack and sort of say, it's okay, have they improved? Are they, and rather than doing this competitive. And I really don't think the assessments that we have do any good. They don't measure learning. I don't know why we continue again. So it comes back to the cat slide. Why do we continue doing this? I came across a 2014 letter to the Guardian, not to the Guardian, to the OECD, written by some of the top educationists around the world, 80 of them, pleading for the OECD to stop doing PISA. It does more damage than good. It still continues. And now, in fact, they are even spreading it across more countries. So, downward spiral. So this is the system that we have. It's very instrumentalist, which means it's about getting output, getting as high qualifications as you can, getting the best job you can, getting the most amount of income that you can get, with nothing else in mind, right? And it's just going back. So a newer form of education is required, and I want to focus really on the emotional dimensions. we tend to slide emotional intelligence as something that is not part of a formal education system. I think many would say in the past this was done within communities. Maybe, I don't agree with that. What I think it would have done in the past is that you have families and they build this emotional intelligence just within yourself and maybe within the broader community, but you still look at anything outside as the other. So we are really good at doing the othering among groups that don't look like us or don't believe with our values. We tend to do the othering and stuff. And emotional intelligence is about looking at those particular issues. And so what I want to show you is an approach that we have done. So we got the rational and the emotional brain, and what some of the latest research on neurosciences sort of say is they're not separate. Your actions are not coming from the emotional side or it's not coming from the cognitive side. It is based on an interplay between the two. It's a matter of how well they are trained in the sense of finally dictating your final behavior. So Kahneman's work on system 1, system 2 thinking is really goes towards this. But the work that I really have enjoyed, I'm an economist by training, I'm a dumb economist by training, but the work that Robert Sapolsky has done in the work on behave talks about really about how these interrelationships work in terms of and making some sense of the system 1 and system 2. So we need a new approach, one based on science and evidence. I found it very interesting that coming into education, it doesn't seem to be really informed by the latest science that's coming out on the science of learning. Cognitive science, the neurosciences, the psychology. It seems to be still driven by very old-fashioned education-based schools. When you talk about evidence, they don't seem to understand evidence. When you talk about science, they don't seem to understand science. Tell you a little bit, if Alberto gives me some time at the end, about an initiative that we are taking on at UNESCO. So this is the whole brain approach to education. We want to stimulate those networks, which is basically from the emotional to the cognitive. I will talk a little bit about what we call this, but this is what we have found from the neurosciences is in terms of activating this neural network automatically every time within your 3-pound structure that you carry between your ears. This is what we have developed at the Institute. It's called Libre. We have this program where we focus on mindfulness. The mindfulness is about self-regulation and emotional regulation, which means within yourself. I think Susan talked a little bit about that. Understanding yourself, finding peace within yourself. You can't find peace if you can't find peace within yourself. And most of us are so stressful and so, in most of the time, lots of anger, frustration. We need to try to calm down and get that stress free. It's not easy. The next one is empathy. It's about the other, trying to understand the other from their perspective, not from your perspective. What we find is when people talk to each other and when we try this listening exercise, most people don't listen. They're already trying to react to the other based on their perspective and not from the other perspective. Extremely difficult. The third one is compassion, is doing something about it. So once you have the empathy, do something about it, and not just sit there and be an idle standby. And a critical inquiry, we built it into it because we wanted to also instill the whole notion of inquiry. Question, question, question. Our education system really doesn't support that. Even when you talk about critical thinking, it sometimes doesn't get into the question approach. Teachers don't like this. So the minute I put that and talk about questioning, 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 they all look at me as, oh, God, he's opening up a can of worms here. But this is what, and the modules that we have developed, let's say one on violence, starts off with this interesting idea of critical inquiry. It's very interesting when we do in India. We did this with 10-year-olds, and the first thing is, who's your enemy? Pakistanis. What do? We kill them. What, 10-year-olds? They want to kill every Pakistani? Like, why? And then when we start buying, then they kind of, well, we've been told to. They say, so what do you happen if that Pakistani that you want to kill has children like you? They say, oh no, then we shouldn't kill parents. We just kill the soldiers. And we start, well, soldiers have their parents as well. So it continues, and then they sort of say, hey, makes no sense what my original idea is. And within that, we build in the empathy training, compassion training. So we don't do it separate. We do it integrated within the concept. So we do climate change, get them all excited, frustrated, and then bring in this kind of perspectives. And we do it across cultures. We do it with students in the US, Norway, India, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, very, very different cultures, very different perspectives. And it's really interesting to see the way they think about it. So we call it firing Gandhi neurons, based from V.C. Ramachandran's work on mirror neurons. And the whole idea is to create this network because I was told to teach Gandhi values, and I resisted on teaching Gandhi values. I said, let's try to create the neural networks that might have been going on in that old man's brain. Might hit it, might not. So some takeaways. Trade-offs and cognitive dissonance is a grounded reality. This is what we have to live with, so accept it. It will always be there. The whole idea is to build that emotional intelligence to navigate that dissonance and to try to balance between the cognitive and the emotions. Because every action that you do, even a rational action, is defined by the emotional state. And the third, our education systems have to be transformed to develop emotional intelligence using a whole brain approach. In a sense, don't break it up into just focusing on cognitive. Even when we talk about sustainable development, most of the time I find it as a cognitive exercise. It's about the cognition, it's about the rationality, rather than trying to get the emotional part into it. And in fact, if you bring in, especially from the indigenous communities and listen to them, you get that emotion with nature. They don't look at it purely as a cognitive exercise, it's about emotions with the nature. And that is what we would need to do. Call to action, this is what we at UNESCO are trying to do. You know how long it takes to get a resolution at the international level, but we want to mainstream SEL education. We were involved in an indirect way with the new education policy in India, and there is a paragraph within that whole policy on social-emotional learning. So it's part of the new education policy. And in one of the states in India, the Andhra Pradesh government has already legislated an act where teachers have to be given 50 hours of social-emotional learning training as part of their B.Ed courses. So if you go into B.Ed courses in that particular state, you will have to now do 50 hours of social-emotional learning. Because you can't teach to the kids if you yourself are not at that level. So, flourishing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And actually, although there is cognitive dissonance, even denial, actually the affirmation of emotional competence is even legislated in some state of your country, so there is a hope. The time is running out, so the next speaker is another of our fellow, Stefan, and he's also medical director of the University of Applied Science in Germany, and 12 minutes, like everybody.
Like everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm learning from this conference that education is twofold: preparing for the unknown and transmitting relevant knowledge from the past to the future. And the single most important question I'm interested in here in this context is, how can we increase the learning curve? How can we increase creativity in a society? And what is the evidence for that, the empirical evidence for that, on an individual level and on a systemic level? I would like to talk about creativity. So when we're talking about creativity, we're actually not talking about Einstein or Da Vinci or Rembrandt. We're not talking about having a specific talent or having fun or happiness or success or wealth. When you're talking about creativity, we're talking about something that happens in each of us, 724, in 7/4 7.4 billion people throughout the entire life. We're talking about something where we explore the world in a unique and individual way. It's something that had never happened before. You can be a very talented medical doctor or a very talented lawyer, but you're not necessarily creative. You might be just simply reproductive. You know, our current system developed in the 18th century. We had about 6 disciplines. Now we have over 1,000 disciplines to cope with. If you go into PISA and compare 50 points, just to keep that in mind, we're getting back to that, 50 points difference on a country level means about 2 years difference in education. And it refers to about 0.6% of economic growth, more or less. And if you're talking about changing the educational system towards more creativity, we're talking about a 50-year time span from financing and implementing the system, of teaching the teachers and then teaching the students and then looking for the outcome. Right? I think we're currently not tapping into the full potentials of what we have in each of us. And I'm going to refer to the so-called Big Five in science. So what can science tell us about how to unleash the full potentials in each of us? How can science unleash creativity? First finding, Heckman equation, okay? We have robust data. You don't have to make pictures, you can have that. The point is, this is the age and this is the return on investment. The older we get, the return on investment for the society and for each of us is getting lower and lower and lower. The return on investment in the first 3 to 5 years is up to 1 to 10, 1 to 15 per dollar. And the lower graph shows you just the opposite. We spend most of our money in higher education and not in lower education. And even preschooling, we spend 95% of our money on the 3 to 5 year old and not on the 0 to 3 year old. If you were smart, we would spend and redistribute that money in a completely different way. Second statement, Haidee Findings. Okay? Haidee analyzed 800 meta-analyses, 50,000 single studies, 80 million students. Okay? It's quite an elephant. Just to answer one question, and the question is, what really works? And he came up with 136 variables. And the point is, what really works is personal and interpersonal skills. They oversteer institutional and socioeconomic skills by a factor 2. If you look closer to it, out of the 136 variables, institutional and socioeconomic factors have an effect size of 0.23. Any personal and interpersonal factors have an effect size which is double as high. So we're talking about concept mapping, self-evaluation, peer tutoring, feedbacking, metacognitive training, etc., etc. Third statement, the so-called input-output fallacy. Big story. There is empirically and statistically a link between input and output in educational systems. So the more you pour in, to some extent, the more you're getting out. Right? Here's input, here's output. This is the school. Right? But if you look closer to the data, it looks a little bit different. You know, Brazil spends the same amount of money on education as South Korea, but South Korea has 176 points in PISA more than Brazil. The US have the same PISA points than Poland, but they spend triple as much. Finland spends the same than Spain, but has 80 points more than Spain, etc., etc., etc. So about a fourth of the output can be correlated to the input, to the physical input, meaning tablets, tables, teachers, repaired toilets, but 3/4 are not. They depend on something else. And they depend on something what we rather call not the curriculum and the cognitive skills, like if you want to become a doctor or a physicist or a teacher. This is the cognitive part. This is relatively, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but relatively secondary. What is empirically relevant is the non-cognitive skills. They make the difference in creativity. Okay? This is empirically a building block of non-cognitive factors along the line of a kid. You start with emotional attachment, self-awareness, executive functioning, impulse control, self-coherence, blah, 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 all the way up. And they do not correlate with what you're studying. It doesn't matter what you're studying. They correlate to the extracurricular part of the whole educational system. How can you improve this non-cognitive, extracurricular parts that would finally increase creativity or the learning curve? That's called the creativity response. We have abundant, contact me afterwards. We have abundant evidence, for example, that exercise, in-class exercise of yoga or sportive exercise within the class increases memory consolidation, prefrontal cortex consolidation, gray matter density. We have, oh my God.
Kronos, the
No, there's no,
non-kairos.
no. We have robust data if you put a kid in the classroom and have him sitting still running a mindfulness-based program of 2 minutes, it increases creativity. It doesn't cost a thing. The same is true for rest and sleep and multisensory learning versus digital learning. And the same is true for social competence and also data on nutrition, what they eat, how they eat, etc., etc. Final, the causal link. You know, the point is, when you do social science, you always look for causalities. And causalities in the social fields are very rare events. In most cases, you have correlations. But if you look in the databases of education, the real clash between societies is not religion or political systems or the culture. It's the societies that educate their people and those who don't. And you find a causal link between the amount of education within the system and, for example, the health outcome. The higher education is, the lower morbidity and mortality is. The higher the education is, the higher the wealth is. You have a college degree, you basically earn 15% more. The higher the education, the higher the health. So a rich mother with poor education has a 50% lower life expectancy than a poor mother with a high education. The same is true for happiness or demography. Okay, a non-educated mother has 5 children, and an educated one has 1.2. The same is true for ecology, and the same is true for our democracy. With a time lag of 2 decades of heavily investing in the education, we end up with democracy. So, this is the wrong side here. Here we go. The take-home message is, I think, we cannot not learn. And if we look at findings in science, we might rethink the way we do education. Okay? And learning isn't education, and learning is not necessarily creativity. And I want you to take home that the cognitive, curricular aspects of becoming a a teacher and the non-cognitive aspect are two different things. And if you consider findings in psychology and lifestyle changes, you can increase creativity in each of us and in society. Last sentence. Education, the difference between education with or without creativity is, with creativity, we start enacting and enabling, we start envisioning new ideas in a unique way. Education without creativity is we become postmen that deliver a letter from A to B and never open the mail. Thank you very much.